All right, we're going to finish up the podcast today with Dave Ungrady. Dave has written 2 Maryland basketball books, Born Ready, which was the story of Len Bias, and he also wrote Legends of Maryland Basketball. And we're going to talk with Dave about a project that he's involved in. It's a 34+1 campaign, Leonard's jersey number 34, plus one 35 years ago. That he played in his final games 35 years ago. We just celebrated last month the famous North Carolina Chapel Hill first win at the Dean Dome game. And, of course, this June it'll be 35 years since his passing. And Dave's joining us now. And I don't know why, and I'm trying to think. It was a friend of mine who texted me the other day. He goes, "We need you to weigh in on this. Bias or Dixon? Who's the best player in Maryland basketball history?" And I just said, it was on Twitter with somebody. And I just said, it's Bias. And I said, Dixon's the greatest winner, and he's no doubt in my mind, he's the second greatest player in Maryland history. But if you watched Len Bias, while they only made Sweet 16s, he was the best player at his position. He was a transformative player for them, and forget about what the pro career would have been. I just thought he was a better all around college player. What's your answer to the question? You wrote a book, Legends of Maryland Basketball. Who was your number one player?
Well, I would. I'm going to pick someone else for impact. Well, actually, let's talk about Dixon and Bias first. As an individual player, ability, just the skills to do things that just blow your mind. That was Len Bias.
Yeah.
For an impact player, and I'm coming to you as I'm a youth soccer coach for Bethesda Soccer in the travel program, and I try to look for impact players. They may not be the best skilled, or they're not going to blow your mind in a certain way, but they will impact the team in certain ways. If you're looking for the impact player, it's Juan Dixon. He helped them win the national championship. He was key more than anyone else, I think, to help them win a national championship. But I'm going to look back at it in the era in the 70s. I mean, I'm looking at John Lucas. Look at what Lucas did for what kind of player he was, and how the program was originally built in the 70s on a consistent level with Lefty. And a lot of that was John Lucas. He was a number 1 draft pick coming out of college, and he had a very successful pro career despite his challenges with drug addictions. So you pick from those 3. I think I may go with Lucas for that. He didn't win a national program. Things were different then, because you had to win. If you recall, you had to win the tournament championship to get into the NCAA. I think there were only 16 teams in the tournament. And you may recall that classic game against NC State. I think it was 74 or 75. They lose in double overtime. It was for the
74. 103 to 100 in overtime.
Yeah, ACC championship. And I'll never forget that game. I watched it. I mean, I loved watching Maryland on TV, and they were on TV a lot. I'll never forget watching that game. Brad Davis, John Lucas, Len Elmore, Tom McMillan. What a team! But
Mo Howard,
Lucas, I think. Yeah, Mo Howard. Lucas is among the top. So I'm going with Dixon for impact, Bias for individual, just wow, and Lucas for he's up there.
Yeah,
so those 3.
It's funny. I was thinking as you're talking. I've gotten to know Mark a little bit, and he asked me last summer, we were somewhere, and there were a bunch of Maryland guys around. He's like, all right, Sheehan, does Cowan make the list, the rafters? And I said, look, he's a great 4-year player, but Anthony's not in the top 10. And he said, give me your top 10. But I'm not going to sit here and bore everybody with the top 10. But I basically said, look, Bias was 1. Juan's our all-time winner. He's the best clutch player in Maryland history. He's the best winner. He was a treasure, for us. But Bias was a higher level individual player, an all-time, sort of combination of athleticism, skill, ferocity, all wrapped up into one. He was an unstoppable force. I mean, he was truly uncheckable from late in his sophomore year until the end of his career there. But number 3 to me, and it gets debated, but it's like, to me, it's not even close. John Lucas is number 3 for me, and then we can start start debating on the rest of the list. And there's a lot of debates. Where's Buck? Where's McMillan? Where's Albert King? Where's Vasquez? All of those guys. But to me, I think we've hit on the three. Whatever order you want to put them in is fine. But Lucas wasn't just the best guard in the country. Lucas was an All-American tennis player.
That's right.
When tennis actually was popular in this country, he's one of the all-time great athletes to ever play at the university. And look, you and I both know this because we're old enough to remember. But Lefty's best teams, didn't get to the tournament. And if that's right, they were the second or third best team in the country in '74, and in '75 they got to the Elite Eight. But the best teams, the '74 team in particular, didn't have a chance. And God knows what would have happened had Moses actually played a game.
That's story in itself.
Yeah, when you talk to Lefty, we did this thing, Dave, with Lefty. I've told this story many times, but Lefty, we had this series called Lunch with a Legend, and we would rent out Ruth Chris, Morton's, downtown Connecticut Avenue, and we did everybody, the legends of this town. Gary Williams, Joe Gibbs, everybody did it, and I'd been trying to get Lefty forever, and of course Lefty wanted to get paid, and I finally said, Lefty, do you want me to drive my station wagon down and park it in front of your house like you did with Moses? And so he laughed, and he finally said, all right, I'll do it.
Good play. That worked well.
But we did have to pay for his travel and his hotel and give him a little bit of cash. To make a long story short, the program started at noon, but he was required to be there at 11:30 because we had a sold-out house, and he was going to be a meet and greet, and he was going to sign some things. And at 11:29 a.m., I look at my phone, and it's Lefty's cell phone. I pick it up. Kevin, it's Lefty. What's up, Lefty? You here? Nah, man. Look, I'm going to need more money to do this thing.
Oh, you got to be kidding me.
And I said, Lefty, are you kidding me? And he just said, nah, man, I'm on the elevator coming up. I got you, though, didn't I? And he gets off the elevator, and he is laughing hysterically. He goes, I got you.
Awesome.
And I said, look, after talking to you over the last couple of months, I believed it. And he just laughed. He couldn't have been better, and the stories he told for 2 hours were unbelievable stories.
He's a great storyteller.
Yeah.
He's a great storyteller.
One of the best.
Yeah,
All right.
yeah.
So
when was that, Kevin? When did you do that?
We did Lefty probably 4 years ago, probably.
That's
Tommy and I did it. Lavero and I did it. We did like 20 of these, and Lefty and Sugar Ray Leonard were the last two we hadn't gotten in terms of DC sports legends, and Lefty was the hardest sell, and I must have pitched him for a year and a half, and he said, did you pay Gary? And I said, no, we didn't pay Gary. Did you pay John Thompson? No, we didn't pay him. He goes, well, that's because they live there. He said, you're gonna have to pay me to get me up from Virginia Beach. I don't know. But anyway, we could tell Lefty stories forever. I want to get to your project, and I want you to talk about everything you're doing. The Born Ready book was awesome on bias, and you're going to update that. But tell everybody about the 34+1 campaign, which is going to turn into a podcast series, etc.
Mm-hmm. Well, it started last summer when I realized next year was going to be 35 years, and then the number and sort of it all, the synergy was there. We started last summer actually working with University of Maryland interns to produce a sizzle reel or a sample reel of what the documentary would look like. And we have that on the site, and the site is GoGradyMedia.com. That's the name of my company, GoGrady Media. And there's a story behind that, which maybe we'll get to from my Maryland days. So we produced the sizzle reel, and we started shopping it around, and we got interest from Octagon Entertainment. I know some people at Octagon, and they connected us to the entertainment division, and now it's evolved to where it's going to be a podcast series. And we want to use that podcast series to generate interest in a possible documentary with Octagon Entertainment. The documentary would focus on, at this point, the element of social change that Len's legacy created. Those familiar with his story know that in large part, the main reason because of his death, Congress in 1986 passed the 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which really changed the way you sentenced cocaine criminals. And we're skewed it to where tens of thousands of young black men started going to prison for crack cocaine and powder cocaine, primarily crack cocaine crimes. And it lasted for decades. It overcrowded prisons. That's the social change aspect of this. I feel, and you may too, Kevin, especially if you read the book, his legacy is so vast. It's not just the impact on federal drug legislation. It's also how it impacted the Celtics, how it impacted Maryland athletics, how it impacted his friends and family, coaches. I was an athlete at Maryland in the late 70s. I was a track team captain, and I played soccer for part of a year. So I knew people in the athletic department, how it affected them, specifically Dick Dull, who was an assistant coach on the track team when I was there. We loved Dick. Everybody loved Dick. And I saw what it did to him personally. Right. I saw what it did to others personally in the athletic department. So that was the interest in writing the book. It's evolved to where we're now with the podcast series. We're updating the book, tied into 35 years plus. And I think the most important part of this thing is all this has evolved since the book came out in 2011. I've sold the book. I've sold the book at lots of youth tournaments, and I set up a table, and it does really well. And people will come up. So this is, it's a great story, but what are you going to do with it? How can you teach people from it? And it made me start thinking. So I started speaking to teenagers and young adults at rec centers, at schools, and about how to become an effective decision maker. Not just a good decision maker, but an effective decision maker. There's a group that's working with us called the Decision Education Foundation, which establishes curriculums for students and really anybody on how to make effective decisions. So the last segment of this podcast series will be on how to make effective decisions. So we want to take all of this, the 34+1 project, and stress effective decision making for teenagers and young adults using Len's story as a tool to attract their attention. You and I know the story. You and I lived it. You went to Maryland when he was there. We understand it. A lot of people know who Len Bias is. They don't know what he was. They heard he died or he was a good basketball player, but there's so much more to it. So we're trying to add to all that.
You can find out much more about what Dave and his group are working on, as he mentioned, by going to GoGradyMedia.com. I think that the part of his legacy that you described briefly that is so amazing, and I think it came from a good spot, in 1986 with, the drug epidemic and the cocaine epidemic and the crack cocaine epidemic of the 80s, with the president at the time, Ronald Reagan, and his wife, Nancy, just say no, that there was a real yearning in this country, and it crossed, I think, all political, lines. I mean, everybody wanted more and stricter, laws when it came to drugs. We had people dying in our streets. We had crime that had increased to ridiculous levels, but it really went overboard, didn't it?
In a big way, and it's my main job is as a public school teacher. I teach social sciences, and one of my classes is government and politics. And while working on the story, I understood the political part of that. But now, having taught government and politics a little more, I really have a much better understanding about this. I'd like to think that the motivations by the politicians were more altruistic, or let's help people, but it was for self-preservation, as politics often is. Yeah. The Democrats wanted to maintain their majority in the Senate and the House. And Tip O'Neill, who was the speaker at the time, and a Celtics fan, by the way, he saw the advantage of pushing some legislation through quickly after Bias's death to deal with this drug crisis, as it was called at the time. It was a crisis. It was a problem.
Yeah.
Sure. Cocaine was, Kevin, I imagine you had a strong social attitude at that time.
There was a lot going on in College Park in the mid-'80s, trust me.
Boy, I'd go to parties, and there'd be beer and there'd be cocaine. But cocaine was just a keg of beer. You'd have people over there with just cocaine in front of them. It was recreational. That's the attitude then.
Right.
And Len's death changed that. And Congress, the Democrats, tried to take advantage of that. And they rushed through this bill that what I address in the book. And without much review before the committees, and this was legislation that was passed within 2 months of when it started, and that doesn't happen often. And this is why this is I think is potentially the most impactful part of his legacy. It still exists today. That issue is still impactful today. Jay Bias is on our scissor reel. We interviewed for him. Don Marcus is working with me on the former Baltimore Sun reporter. He's working with us on this. And he interviewed Jay, and Jay has a soundbite on our sizzle reel. Please go see it if you haven't, or anyone who's listening. And he said that's the part of the story that needs to be told more. It's his soundbite, and you can see in his face there's anguish about, he was an attorney. He's got legal training. He knows this part of the story, and he says that's the part of the story that needs to be told more. So that's why it's important for us to even focus on that. As we go the documentary route, if we still stay with that focus, but that's the interest now.
Yeah, and the other part of this, and it was the Cleveland Browns safety, Don Rogers. Don Rogers was an NFL safety for the Cleveland Browns, and within a month or two after Bias's death, he died of a cocaine overdose. So it was those two deaths, Bias's being the most significant, because remember, too, the physical features. Bias was such a physical specimen. Like, people looked at him and said, how can anything kill this guy? And he was so great. He was such a magnificent athlete that it really hit hard. And not to mention the fact that it was within hours after he had been drafted and had been, in Boston. But, for those that don't know that part of the Len Bias story, it was major legislation that really led to mandatory minimum sentences increasing significantly for drug-related crimes, which ultimately put many more, minorities in particular, and those of less means into jail for much longer periods of time than they had been doing before. But am I wrong about this? It was not an unpopular legislation,
not at all.
In 1986.
3 months. Sure, yeah. And again, it's the political, it's self-preservation that the Democrats were trying to take advantage of.
Right.
And to be a little more clear on what that law addressed, it addressed many things, but most significantly, 100-to-1 disparity between crack and powder cocaine. If you had 5 grams of powder cocaine, you got a mandatory minimum of 5 years in prison. If you had 100 grams of crack cocaine, I'm sorry, it's the reverse.
Right.
5 grams of crack, 100 grams of powder. Same mandatory minimum sentence, 5 years. Who was using crack? The young black men, young black adults, males, and it skewed against them, and it's really created a problem with our prisons and sentencing reform. So it's still an issue that exists today.
By the way, one last thing, and again, go to GoGradyMedia.com to find out more about what Dave and his group are working on. It's fascinating. But I was playing golf a few days ago, and somebody said to me, it's Len Bias's death still impacts the program today. And I said, I don't think so. I think that ship sailed a long time ago. We were talking about recruiting. And he said, no, you're missing my point. He goes, if Len Bias were alive today, and if he had the NBA career that we thought he was going to have, and if he had become like this all-time, NBA icon, like Jordan became, as an example, North Carolina's never needed Jordan to be a recruiter for North Carolina. North Carolina recruits on name alone, but imagine the recruiter that Len Bias would have been for anybody coaching at Maryland. And I thought about that, and I think actually that's a really good point. Had he lived, and we're talking now more about sort of the basketball side of it, had he lived, the ambassador that he would have been for the university, and the way, if he had a similar NBA career to his college career, and he had been a human highlight reel like Dominique Wilkins was, like Jordan was, and he had been even years after his NBA career ended, had been a player that young players continued to look up to, it really would have been, I think, impactful to recruiting.
It could have been very significant. And I'll add something with that. And Gary Williams talks about how recruiting was so difficult for him.
Right.
after he came in, because he would start recruiting athletes. And, hey, is this is the school where Len Bias does? Yeah, I don't want to go there. So this went for years.
Yeah.
And Gary will talk about that. If I can add one thing, Kevin, before we
Sure.
end this, something that's timely. We started something called the Len Bias Fandom promotion. It starts actually April 1st, but we're starting to promote it on our social media platforms. We're asking people to submit their most fond memories and reflections of Len, good and bad. It affected, it hurt lives, it saved lives, to be candid. So if you go to our, there's GoGradyMedia.com/fandom, all the information's there. We're going to pick the best submissions, and there will be prizes. This will build all the way up to June 19th. So we're going to pick the top 10, and then we'll pick a finalist, and then we're going to have fun with this, just so this will help everybody, again, grasp and understand his full legacy, because it's not just these great stories about his athleticism and as a basketball player, but these sober and somber reflections and stories about how his death affected things. So we started that this week, and that'll be going through June 19th.
June 19th, 1986 was one of the worst days I'll never forget. It was one of those for many of us. It was one of those, yeah. You knew where you were when you heard the news. But I love what you're doing. And when you have the results come back, I mean, from his jumper to beat UT Chattanooga in the tournament as a freshman to the game he had against Duke in the ACC finals the year later. But, number one, I can tell you right now what number one's going to be. It's going to be the Carolina game in Chapel Hill, where he went, for an incredible 35 and rebounds and the block shot on Kenny Smith's drive and overtime, etc. That's going to be number one. Although I'll tell you what, there were games that he played. His final game at Cole against Virginia, Olden Polynice put up a shot, and I was very close to the floor, and you heard Leonard go up and snag it midair and say, "Get that shit out of here," and he threw it into the fourth row. And he had such a great game against UVA. His final game against UNLV was a brilliant basketball game, and it's just a shame.
It was a great game to watch.
Great game to watch.
The last 10 minutes, he just took it over.
Took it over.
Wasn't enough.
And they had an 8-point lead, and somehow they blew it. I don't know. I still, to this day, that was almost as devastating a loss as Gravis's final game against Michigan State was.
Well, also in that first half against UNLV, Len really was chunking it. He was missing shots. He wasn't playing well. But this is the kind of player he was. He knew, and he didn't have, for some reason, his teammates were not helping him out too much in that game. He felt he had to take it upon himself. Those last 10 minutes are great to watch to see what kind of player he was. He took it upon himself. He was fighting it. He put his head down. Okay, I'm going to see what I can do to save this team. That's the kind of player he was. One other thing I'd like to say about Fandom, and you talk about these great moments that people know about. We already had somebody send something in last night, a gentleman who actually said he was recruiting Len to be his agent. And he got after Len died, he stopped being an agent. He was so upset and went in to become a successful businessman. But he said he would go to Maryland practices. And he told a story about how at the end of practice, Lefty would get all the players at shooting foul shots, and one player would shoot, and everybody else would be around them and yelling and screaming at them, simulating a loud crowd, and so they can focus. And he said when Len was up there, with everybody yelling at him, and after you make one, everybody gets closer. You make another, you get closer and louder. Len, he remembers Len making 38 in a row in that environment. That's the kind of stuff I want to hear. That's great stuff.
That is great stuff.
We'll get a lot more of that, and Kevin will be happy to share that as we go down the road with him.
I would love to. And, back then, and I was in school then, you could walk right into Cole in the middle of practice and sit right in Cole and watch practice. And, Lefty would walk out of that office up on the concourse level, and you'd hear that booming voice. And Lefty, people don't realize this that don't know, Lefty was 6'6". Like, he was an imposing figure, not to mention the charisma, but those were the days. I wish you the best of luck, and definitely on the Fandom thing, come back and we'll talk about it down the road.
Appreciate your support.
Yep. Dave Ungrady, everybody. Again, GoGradyMedia.com.